In the 1970s, Oakland had plenty of hustlers, but none moved the way Felix Mitchell did. He came up out of the 69th Street projects with a tight crew, a disciplined mind, and a blueprint that made his name untouchable. To most people, he looked quiet, almost harmless. But to the streets, he was the architect of an operation that changed the entire Bay Area. His rise sparked gang wars, rattled law enforcement, and left behind a legacy so heavy that even his funeral brought the whole city to a standstill. This is the story of how a kid with nothing became Oakland's most feared kingpin. Felix Wayne Mitchell Jr.'s story didn't start with the legend. It started with the kid trying to climb his way out of the 69th Street projects in Oakland. Born on August 23, 1954, he grew up surrounded by poverty, pressure, and the kind of environment that either breaks you or pushes you to hustle harder. And Felix, he chose the hustle. From early on, he had this natural gift for pulling people together. Even after dropping out of high school, he carried himself like someone who saw a bigger picture. Bit by bit, he built a circle of tough, street-savvy men, cats who were already known in the neighborhood, and he gave their crew a name that felt personal, the 69 Mob. To them, mob didn't mean some wild gangster slogan. It meant my other brother. That alone tells you how he operated. His power wasn't just fear, it was loyalty. Felix himself stood out everywhere he went. Tall, slim, soft-spoken, but commanding the room without raising his voice. He had that diamond-filled hourglass chain he loved to show off, and he'd sit his lieutenants down to watch The Godfather like it was homework. He ran his world the same way, calculated, structured, and disciplined, and the empire grew fast. The 69 Mob didn't just take over Oakland, their reach stretched across the entire Bay Area. Heroin was the engine, and Felix was the architect. He tapped into suppliers, runners, and dealers across California and even reached as far as Detroit. Linking up with LA Kingpin Tootie Reese opened even more doors, helping him build a network that moved like a corporation instead of a street gang. But with growth came consequences. The drugs flowing through his operation brought chaos, addiction, and violence to neighborhoods already struggling to survive. His name traveled far, earning him the alias Felix the Cat, a nickname that gave him a mysterious, almost mythical reputation in the streets and made law enforcement even more determined to bring him down. By early 1976, the mob was fully active in San Antonio Village, a housing project in Oakland. They weren't sloppy or unorganized. Felix built a hierarchy with 20 to 25 members, each slot with a defined role. Some moved the product, some collected the cash, and the lookouts kept watch for cops, quick to whistle, yell, or tap a signal anytime danger rolled up. Walkie-talkies stayed buzzing. Money flowed up the ladder all day until it hit Felix, who then paid everybody out like a real CEO. The operation was making serious money, sometimes up to $15,000 a day, and the demand was outrageous. Addicts didn't just come from the block, they came from all over the Bay, hopping buses and trains just to buy from the mob. It became one of the biggest open-air drug markets the area had ever seen. Naturally, that kind of action didn't stay hidden for long. Local police, federal agencies, everybody had eyes on Felix. But taking him down wasn't simple. His crew was sharp, disciplined, and always one step ahead. Every time law enforcement applied pressure, the mob shifted. First, they got pushed to Berkeley, then forced out again. They moved west, settling in the Campbell housing projects. They bounced from neighborhood to neighborhood, setting up shop wherever they could keep the heat down. The run finally slowed in 1978 when Felix was arrested on drug charges. That arrest marked the end of the mob's open-air domination. But in a twist straight out of a crime drama, those charges were later tossed out on a technicality. By the early 1980s, Felix Mitchell wasn't just running a drug operation, he was running an empire that moved like a whole corporation planted in the heart of the East Oakland projects. Folks in the neighborhood even had a name for it, the heroin supermarket. And that wasn't an exaggeration. He operated right out of ragged apartments in the San Antonio Villa projects on 65th and 69th Avenue, turning those rundown buildings into the headquarters of a multi-million-dollar hustle. He kept everything tight and controlled. He put young kids, children who had no business being in that world, on lookout duty. He sold dope with a system designed to keep police as far away as possible. Addicts didn't get face-to-face access. Instead, The product got dropped through hoses or chutes from upstairs windows, and the cash had to slide through little slits in the doors. And anybody trying to buy had to prove they were real users by showing their needle marks. Felix wasn't about to let an undercover cop slip through, but as his operation expanded, everybody else in the game took notice. When somebody's pulling in that kind of cash and controlling that much of the street supply, rivals start circling. Two major crews stepped up to challenge the '69 mob, Funktown, USA, led by Harvey Washington, and The Family, run by Mickey Moore. These weren't petty neighborhood beefs. These were serious battles over who controlled the Bay Area's heroin pipeline. Those battles got ugly quick. Violence became routine. The mob was making anywhere from $400,000 to $1 million a month, and that kind of money paints a target on your back. Mitchell fought to protect every inch of his territory, and while he was fighting, he was also living loud. European cars, designer clothes, massive parties. He leaned all the way into the persona of an Oakland star. But he didn't just soak it up for himself. He put money back into the community, donating to youth groups and neighborhood programs. To a lot of people, he was a villain and a savior at the same time. Things hit a boiling point in August 1980. This wasn't just hustling anymore. It was a full-scale war. The mob used intimidation and brute force to keep their blocks locked down. Anyone trying to sell heroin inside their territory was risking their life. Within 3 days, police found 6 murder victims connected directly to the escalating conflict. The dead included Carlos Durantes, Sandra Adamson, Vindisha Davis, Red Walker, Ricky Walker, Terry Hatter, and Charles Dorsey. 2 others, Helen Campbell and Alvin Gaye, were shot but survived. Oakland police were drowning in bodies. The violence was so severe they named the stretch of killings Bloody August. And once they connected the dots, they decided it was time to go after the man they believed was calling all the shots, Felix Mitchell. By 1981, Mitchell was facing 4 murder charges. He was 27, living in a mansion in Los Angeles when officers arrested him, believing he had ordered multiple killings to protect his control of the heroin trade. Investigators listed 12 special circumstance allegations tied to those murders. Even one conviction would have put him in line for the death penalty. Authorities kept saying the same thing. Felix was the kingpin of the '69 mob, the one operating that so-called heroin supermarket out of San Antonio Village and the Acorn Apartments. And according to police, his crew had terrorized residents, kicking families out of their apartments for hours at a time so drug deals could run uninterrupted. 3 of the murders he was charged with were connected to the war with the family. Police found the bodies of 2 of their members and a woman in the Oakland Hills, a triple homicide that shocked the whole city. But detectives believed there were even more victims, possibly 3 additional killings in that same week tied to the same conflict. 4 other men, Charles Lewis, Kirk Usher, Donald Moore, and Alvin Gaye, were also arrested. Lieutenant Terry Green said those 5 men formed the entire leadership chain of the mob. Police were sure they had the right crew and they expected more arrests to follow. They believed they were finally closing the chapter on the mob. But then everything flipped. A lack of solid evidence forced prosecutors to drop 3 of the 4 murder charges. The triple homicide case against Mitchell and the 4 other men just didn't hold up. Without that, the alleged henchmen walked free, and the police were left with only one count, the 1977 murder of Carlos Durantes. Durantes had never been part of any gang. According to Lieutenant Green, he was an innocent man who got mistaken for someone trying to invade mob territory. His killing was a tragic example of how reckless and unforgiving the drug war had become. Even with 3 charges dropped, Felix still had to face the remaining murder count, and police weren't letting go. Green made it clear they planned to dig deeper and expected more arrests in the Durantes case. The bigger picture was bleak. Green admitted that roughly a quarter of Oakland's murders every year were drug-related, most of them tied to the violent back and forth between the mob and the family. It was a cycle that kept swallowing lives, innocent or not, as the city struggled to survive the storm created by a war over heroin and control. Now, around this time, the streets of Oakland were buzzing with tension, and the pressure around Felix Mitchell's empire was reaching its boiling point. So when April 1983 rolled in, everything started moving fast. It kicked off when the Oakland Police Department finally snatched up Leslie Brigham on a murder charge. Now, anyone who knows that life knows what usually happens next. Once you're sitting in that cold cell, staring at those walls, cooperating starts sounding real tempting. And that's exactly what Brigham started doing, quietly talking to the feds who were gearing up to take down the man running the whole show, Felix Mitchell. But Mitchell had eyes everywhere. On April 17th, while Brigham was still locked up, Mitchell's own attorney walked into that jail and tried to shut everything down. She told Brigham straight up that cooperating wasn't in his best interest. Then she pulled out a handwritten note from Felix himself, a message telling Brigham not to testify, not to talk, not to fold. The pressure on Brigham was getting heavier by the minute. Meanwhile, another move was happening behind the scenes. Just a couple days earlier, around April 15th, Lester had pulled McGill and a few others into a quiet meeting. They weren't discussing small talk, they were figuring out how to get Brigham out of jail before he said too much. This wasn't even a new worry. Back in February, at another meeting attended by both Lester and Mitchell, Felix had already expressed fear that his own arrest was coming soon and that Brigham might crack under federal heat. So at that April 15th meeting, Lester laid it out crystal clear. Brigham had to be released because everyone knew he was ready to talk. Lester didn't just approve the plan, he funded it. He told McGill to grab $1,000 in cash to post toward Brigham's bail. But before Lester and his people could even make a move, Oakland police flipped the script. Instead of releasing Brigham into the hands of his crew, they quietly delivered him straight to the FBI for temporary protection. On April 18th, the feds checked Brigham and his wife into a motel in San Francisco, giving them a safe place to breathe. But that safety didn't last long. Within 2 days, Brigham and his wife slipped out and headed back to Oakland, landing at his sister's place. And this is where Brigham made a critical mistake. He called Tony Mitchell, Felix's brother, and left a message letting him know exactly where he was. That call set off a chain reaction. Soon after, Lester called the same house and found out Brigham was there. Brigham panicked and immediately tried to reach the Justice Department attorney. But while he was still on that call, the front door swung open and in walked Lester, Lester's brother Tony, and Tony Mitchell himself. The timing couldn't have been worse. Brigham quickly switched up, pretending the call was about something harmless. After a tense conversation and even a call to Felix Mitchell himself, the decision was made. Brigham needed to disappear for a while, so he was moved to a motel in Alameda, escorted by Lester's brother, who paid for the room and dropped $300 in Brigham's hand, telling him to sit tight until morning. The next day, McGill showed up, just like planned. He and Brigham, along with their wives, shacked up at another Alameda motel for about 3 days. Money eventually started running low, so the two men drove over to Annie McDonald's place, where she handed McGill $500. With that cash, the group took off for San Diego. They ended up laying low there for about 3 weeks, living in motels paid for by one of Felix Mitchell's girlfriends, always in cash. Money kept coming in from Oakland, usually passed through Lester's brother, and McGill would split it with Brigham. But hiding only lasts so long. When they finally returned to Oakland, the FBI swooped in and arrested Brigham again. That arrest led to bigger charges. Lester and McGill were indicted for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and obstructing a criminal investigation. And the government's case leaned heavily on two key insiders, Brigham himself and another ex-gang member named Norbert Blewett. At trial, prosecutors came armed. 3 former members of the mob, Fred Sanders, Blewett, and Brigham, had all flipped, entered the federal witness protection program, and stepped onto the stand. They painted the full picture. The heroin sales, the structure of the operation, the violent enforcement, the murders, all of it. The government backed that testimony with stacks of evidence, documents, outside records, police reports, and witness accounts. But the story stretched back even further. Felix Mitchell and several others had been federally indicted on February 18, 1983, charged with conspiracy to distribute heroin and income tax evasion for crimes dating all the way back to 1976. He was arraigned in March, hit with a massive $2.5 million bail. His first trial started in June 1983 under Judge Orrick, but by July, it collapsed into a mistrial. A second trial followed, and this time the government got what it wanted. Felix Mitchell was convicted, not just for heroin distribution, but for directing a full-scale criminal enterprise, plus tax evasion, and failing to file returns. Even while the defense was still appealing issues from the mistrial in December 1983, The court stepped in and reduced his bail from $2.5 million down to $1 million. Now, when February 17th, 1984 came around, things took another wild turn. Oakland police rolled up on a car parked off to the side of the road. Inside were two familiar faces in the front seat, Kenny Dickens and Melvin Lester, both connected to the mob. In the back seat sat LaVon Henderson, a juvenile caught in the middle of grown man business. Officers flashed their badges, and instead of chilling and talking it out, the car shot off. Tires screeching, engine roaring, the whole thing jumped off fast. Dickens and Lester had their own version of why they took off. According to them, the officers weren't wearing uniforms and were pointing big guns at the car. They said it scared the life out of them, so instead of waiting around, they pressed the gas. Whatever the real story was, it still turned into a full-blown chase. During that chase, officers claimed they saw Lester trying to toss a plastic bag out the window. The car was shaking too much for him to pull it off. A few seconds later, after the car steadied a bit, Dickens supposedly leaned over and chucked the bag out onto the street. Officers later doubled back, searched the area, and said they found a bag holding 110 balloons of heroin. Both Dickens and Lester denied every bit of that. To them, there was no bag, no drugs, nothing. But one thing the police definitely did notice was the ring Lester had on, worth between $2 and $5 grand. Not exactly the accessory of a man living clean. Once Lester hit the witness stand, things got even messier. The prosecutor wasted no time going straight for the nerve. He asked Lester point blank whether Felix Mitchell had given him the ring. Lester denied it without blinking. But that denial only opened the door to even more questions. Questions about his relationship with Felix, questions about what exactly Felix's business really was. Then it got tense. When Lester denied that Mitchell was the boss of the mob, the prosecutor dug deeper. He started bringing up an old trial, Lester's own brother's case, where a witness had supposedly identified Lester as being part of the mob. Lester denied that too, but denial didn't slow the prosecutor down. He kept applying pressure, and eventually the jury heard the most damaging detail. The mob was in the drug business. Once that landed, the courtroom energy shifted. Lester and Dickens immediately objected. They even moved for a mistrial. Their argument then, and the same one they pushed on appeal, was that the prosecutor had crossed the line. They said this whole line of questioning unfairly painted them as members of an organized crime group, poisoning the jury against them. The government had a mixed response. They admitted one thing, that bringing up the identification at Lester's brother's trial was premature. But everything else, they stood firm. They insisted the questions about Felix and the mob were perfectly legitimate. Jumping back on the timeline, October 22nd, 1984 was another important date. Mitchell tried once again to get his bail reduced. The court wasn't falling for it. They told him any reconsideration would only happen if he could prove something had significantly changed since the last bail decision. Mitchell didn't quit. On November 19th, he renewed that motion, this time flashing an offer of employment in Oakland as proof he wasn't a flight risk. Then came the 1985 trial, easily the heaviest chapter of his story. Witnesses stepped forward and claimed Mitchell's organization was involved in at least 7 murders, with some of those killings allegedly ordered by Mitchell himself. Prosecutor George Nispolo painted the gang as a machine with 25 to 30 members, pulling in nearly $400,000 a month. The money was flowing fast, but it came with a dark cost, thousands of addicts, many forced to keep using just to keep working. On June 4th, 1985, inside a San Francisco courtroom, Judge Marilyn Hall Patel delivered the final blow. Mitchell received the maximum sentence, life without the possibility of parole. She didn't sugarcoat her reasoning, calling his reign over the Oakland housing projects nothing less than terror. But the coldest part came from Mitchell himself. Before sentencing, he told his probation officer he liked money, jewelry, and fine cars, and went out and got them. Then he finished with a twisted question, asking if that wasn't the American way. By August 1986, Felix was deep into his sentence at Leavenworth Penitentiary, locked away but still carrying the weight of his name. Then, without warning, everything came crashing down. On August 21st, 1986, guards found him collapsed in his cell around 3 in the afternoon. He'd been stabbed repeatedly, 10 wounds in total. Prison spokesman Jeff Duncan later confirmed that he was taken to Cushing Memorial Hospital, but the damage was too severe. Mitchell died on August 26th at 1:59 a.m., the victim of a brutal attack no one claimed and no one could explain. There were no suspects, no motive, nothing but silence and blood. Duncan wouldn't discuss Mitchell's behavior inside the prison, and the FBI stepped in to investigate. Even locked up, his story still came with mystery. 4 days after his death, Oakland saw a scene that stopped traffic, literally. On August 30th, 1986, more than 1,000 people lined up outside his East Oakland home. You'd expect a crowd like that for a celebrity or a national icon, but this was for a man whose life was wrapped in crime, violence, and gold chains. Yet the turnout said everything. Felix Mitchell still held power, even in death. The send-off was pure spectacle. 2 horses pulled a carriage carrying his body in an intricately designed bronze casket. The neighborhood, struggling with projects, boarded up buildings, and the grind of unemployment, watched this over-the-top display of wealth glide past like a movie scene. Some came to pay respects, others came out of curiosity, but everyone felt the weight of it. City officials were horrified. They'd spent years trying to steer kids away from the street life, and here was a funeral that looked more like a king's parade. Councilman Wilson Riles Jr. warned that it sent the wrong message, that drug dealing had heroes. Councilman Leo Bazile didn't sugarcoat it either, calling the whole thing glorification of a murdering thug. But all the outrage in the world didn't stop the procession. It rolled through the city for 2 hours, tying up traffic across an 8-mile stretch, passing downtown in Lake Merritt, the very same area Mitchell once controlled through fear and dope money. The funeral looked like organized royalty. A stone-faced man in a gray top hat and black tails led the horses. Behind him came a fleet of luxury, 4 Rolls Royces, 10 white limousines, and a lineup of Cadillacs and Lincolns shining like they belonged in a rap video. Big men in sharp black tuxedos with shaved heads and red roses in their lapels flanked the family, holding each other when the emotion hit too hard. Mitchell's relatives wore red and black, turning grief into choreography. Before the funeral, Detective Everett Greminger didn't hold back at headquarters. He had chased Mitchell since 1976 and knew exactly what the man had built. He said Mitchell was a heroin dealer who started in the Oakland projects, spread to Sacramento, and linked up with the right people in Los Angeles. He called him a low-life scumbag and made it clear he wasn't buying into any martyr story. To him, justice had already been served, a life sentence for a life of destruction. But on the street, the views were much more complicated. A woman named Eliva Clark said he showed young kids they didn't have to stay poor. Another man, Sam Johnson, admired how Mitchell built himself up from nothing, saying he did what he had to do in a world where being a black man meant nothing came easy. To Johnson, Mitchell was a fighter. Then there was the 11-year-old boy in the Yankees cap, stretching on his toes just to get a better look at the casket. Mitchell had been his neighbor once. He thought the whole funeral was amazing. He said Mitchell was cool. Cool clothes, cool cars, even slipped his mother money sometimes. When asked if he knew where that money came from, the boy smirked and said he did, but shouldn't say. That little grin said everything about the influence Mitchell still had, but not everyone standing out there was impressed. One woman holding her 10-month-old great-granddaughter worried that kids would look at all this and see glory instead of consequences. Another mother, Carletta Fail, said he would look larger than life in their eyes. She hoped the spectacle scared them instead of inspiring them. She reminded anyone listening that you can live big, but you can die big too. Now, inside the Star Bethel Baptist Church over on San Pablo and Stanford, the scene hit a whole different level. The building was overflowing, about 1,800 people crammed inside and another 1,000 plus outside holding their spots. And while folks moved past the open casket, Sade's smooth operator floated through the speakers. Not a hymn, not a choir, just that smooth, cool, almost ironic track setting the tone while people whispered their goodbyes. The church was stacked with flowers too, at least 24 arrangements everywhere you looked. One stood out more than the rest. White flowers wrapped around a black paper cat with Felix spelled out in bright red blossoms. That one said everything without saying a word. Before things officially got rolling, one of the associate pastors had to remind everybody they were in God's house, even asking the brothers in the back to take off their hats. Then, Reverend Ivory Rideau stepped up to the front. With more than 1,500 people pressed inside and another crowd swelling outside, He used that moment to preach straight gospel. He didn't go deep into Felix's life, didn't touch the criminal side, didn't try to rewrite anything. He just kept coming back to one message: God is merciful. Off to the side sat a floral arrangement shaped like a dollar sign, shining with gold tinsel, almost winking at the whole situation. The program itself was simple and dark, listing Felix's birthday, August 20th, 1954, and the stark line that followed: departed this life, August 22nd, 1986, Leavenworth, Con. And as Reverend Rideau wrapped up and the people began to file out, Sade came back one more time. Smooth operator slid through the speakers again, soft and steady, as hundreds made their final pass by the casket before stepping back out into the Oakland air. Then in 1987, the whole situation around Mitchell's case played out like a courtroom drama with real stakes, real tension, and real emotions. On one side stood a federal judge with a conscience she refused to ignore, and on the other stood the legacy of one of Oakland's most infamous drug kings, along with hundreds of thousands of dollars the government was fighting to keep in its grip. Judge Marilyn Hall Patel, sitting in San Francisco, was handed a direct order from the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. That order told her to wipe Mitchell's criminal record clean, completely erase the convictions of a man she believed had left real damage behind. She knew exactly who Felix Mitchell was and what his reign meant for Oakland. So when the moment came to sign off on that dismissal, she couldn't do it. She pushed back, saying she couldn't put her name on something that felt that wrong. And instead of going against her own conscience or going against the higher court, she stepped off the case altogether. It was her way of saying the system might demand it, but she wouldn't be the one to sign it. Legally, though, the situation was messy. Mitchell's co-defendants, their convictions stayed put, but Mitchell himself had died before his appeal could even be heard. And under the law, if someone dies mid-appeal, the conviction gets voided. It's a technicality, sure, but a powerful one, and it meant his charges had to be erased on paper. That created a whole new headache for federal prosecutors. They were right in the middle of trying to take hold of Mitchell's property. Big ticket items too, a Northridge home worth up to $500,000. A couple of fancy cars, jewelry, and personal items stacked at around 40 grand. All of it believed to be paid for with drug money, and all of it suddenly harder to keep if the man's record no longer legally existed. Inside the courtroom, Judge Patel laid out her struggle clearly. She talked openly about feeling torn between what the law required and what her conscience could handle. In the end, she turned the case over to another judge, saying someone else might be able to sign that order without feeling the same weight she did. Even prosecutors understood where she was coming from. Joseph Rusoniello, the U.S. attorney at the time, said he felt for her. He pointed out that she had sat through Mitchell's entire trial and had heard everything the city had lived through during his run. To him, her reaction made sense. He said rejecting the order was her way of pushing back at the idea that Mitchell could suddenly be treated like an innocent man, at least on paper, after years of being considered Oakland's public enemy number one. But Mitchell's appeal lawyer, Philip Cherney, saw things differently. He insisted Mitchell actually had a strong appeal lined up, one strong enough that Felix might have only ended up serving around 10 years. His argument centered on double jeopardy, saying the prosecutors hit Mitchell twice with charges for the same conspiracy. Cherney believed that point alone could have flipped the whole case if Felix had lived long enough to fight it. Then, the appeals court came through with a unanimous ruling. All of Mitchell's convictions had to be tossed out because he died before any judge could rule on them. The prosecution was furious. They felt the ruling turned a heroin dealer into some kind of martyr, and they immediately began planning to challenge the decision or even take it to the Supreme Court if they had to. The convictions being thrown out didn't just change the historical record. It threatened to unravel the government's hold on everything they seized. That meant the Southern California house, the luxury cars, the jewelry, all of it could slip from their hands. And keep in mind, the evidence at trial had included roughly $40,000 worth of jewelry pulled straight from Mitchell himself. Felix had originally been found guilty in 1985 on a heavy stack of charges: drug conspiracy, running a continuing criminal enterprise, and multiple counts of tax evasion. The sentence was life with no chance at parole. But with the appeal erased by his death, the legal system had no choice but to pretend those convictions never happened. To his attorney, it was a hollow victory. To prosecutors, it was a disaster. And to the city that lived through the Felix Mitchell era, it was one more complicated chapter in a story that was never simple in the first place.